Hi, thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking about a data analysis project that I worked on in collaboration with Emily Burns and Peter Cowan at Save the Redwoods League, which also funded this project, and Healy Hamilton at NatureServe. And we were focusing on really understanding climatic variation across the range of the coast redwood, both during the sort of typical 20th century climate and then understanding how those patterns are changing over recent decades as a result of climate change that's already unfolding across this landscape. This is a question that has been looked at by a number of other studies, but we sort of had a set of key questions that we thought sort of remained open and we were looking to address through these new approaches. So those sort of fall into three categories. Really looking at the data availability for actually studying climate variation in coastal California, the quality and relevance of that data. Then thinking about ways of quantifying the dominant climatic variation across the redwood domain, and finally looking at how climate change is influencing those patterns. For source data, we use distribution data on the geographic locations of redwoods. This is based on remote sensed forestry data. Peter gave a talk on this earlier today. And for the purposes of this talk, we're then using the Huck 12 level watersheds that contain redwoods as the major spatial domain of the redwood. So this shows total forest cover. Actually, that legend's a little bit wrong there. Total forest cover across the Huck 12 watersheds containing redwoods. For climate data, we use the PRISM climate data set. This is a widely used data set across the environmental sciences. It has a 1 kilometer resolution, and we use the time series version of this data set. It has a layer for every year, for every climate variable. For the sort of baseline envelope analysis, we looked at the average 30-year mean across 1950 to 1979 as a representation of the typical baseline late Holocene climate here in coastal California. And then for the climate change portion of the analysis, we looked at the individual years from 1950 through 2014. We use quarterly variables, so DJF is December, January, February, MAM, March, April, May, etc. And we are using 4 climate variables for this analysis. Average nighttime minimum and daily maximum temperature across the season. We log transformed precipitation so that it behaved a bit better statistically and made more ecological sense. And then this 4th variable, DPD, is dew point depression. That's not natively available in the PRISM data set, but we calculated it based on a couple other variables, and I'll talk about that in a second. Of course, it's difficult to have a discussion about climate in coastal California without thinking about fog. We know that redwoods are closely associated with fog, and it would be really great to have gridded data sets that represent some dimension of fog variability, the way that we have for temperature and precipitation, in order to understand patterns of fog in coastal California. But unfortunately, there isn't really much great fog data out there. Most weather stations don't collect fog data. Satellite data can pick up on low clouds, but that's not the same thing as ground level fog and doesn't go back very far in history. So we're really interested in trying to find out whether we can use this dew point depression variable as an approximation of fog patterns in coastal California to add this really important dimension to our analysis of climate. So dew point depression is basically simply the difference between air temperature and dew point temperature. When those are identical and dew point depression is 0, water condenses out of the air and fog forms. When dew point depression is large, fog can't form. So there's this pretty robust first principle physical relationship between dew point depression and fog. And the question we had was whether this would scale up and hold at a monthly level, right? Most of these gridded climate data sets like PRISM have a monthly time resolution. Can we use monthly average dew point depression as an approximation for monthly fog frequency here in California? To look at this question, we use the Surface Airways Observation data set, which is collected at airports up and down the coast here. They collect information on temperature and dew point, which gives us dew point depression, and also on cloud ceiling and horizontal visibility, which gives us fog. So when we look at the monthly relationship between average dew point depression and total fog frequency, we see this pretty nice correlation for such a simple simple model, really. So Dewpoint depression has a pretty consistent and statistically significant relationship with fog frequency, both across space and through time in coastal California. So we're pretty excited by the ability to use this Dewpoint depression variable, which we calculate in PRISM, as a metric for fog variation here in coastal California, and be able to really account for fog for the first time in spatial analysis of redwood climate variation. And the second question is really just how much we can trust these gridded climate surfaces in general that people use so often and somewhat blindly sometimes in terms of their ability to actually capture spatial variation in climate correctly, right? These interpolated climate surfaces are essentially using weather station data to try and predict the weather at locations without stations. How do we know that's good? Well, luckily, the Redwood and Climate Change Initiative has installed a set of weather stations in redwood trees up and down the coast of California, and we're able to use data from those weather stations to actually evaluate the accuracy of the PRISM climate data for this part of the world. And long story short, what we see basically is that for all three of our key climate variables, temperature, dewpoint depression, which again is a fog metric, and precipitation, we're getting pretty tight fits between the PRISM estimates and the actual observed values for monthly climate in the redwood forest itself. So this is another new contribution that we're able to make in terms of understanding that this climate data that's so often used is actually doing a pretty good job at capturing climate variability in the redwood forests. So on to this first question of how we can think about climate variability across space within the redwoods during the baseline 30-year period from 1950 to 1970. We have these 16 variables, right, 4 variables times 4 months that we're looking at. How do we make sense of this sort of high-dimensional data set? One good way to do that is through a principal component analysis. So we take these 16 correlated variables and find the sort of underlying, non-redundant, uncorrelated components that describe the major facets of climate variability here in coastal California. And what we see is that there's basically first principal component describes about half of the total variability among those 16 climate variables, and it's essentially a latitudinal gradient. It's a monotonic increase from the north to the south. So we can sort of think of this as principal component 1 being southiness or something. Principal component 2, on the other hand, is basically a coastal gradient. This is picking up on the dimension of climate variability that is this steep climate gradient extending from the coast to the interior margin. We know that's a very steep climate gradient. That's what's responsible for the narrow, restricted band of redwood distribution. And that accounts for, again, more than a quarter of the total variation. The third principal component accounts for a much smaller portion. It's primarily an elevational component, and I'll basically be ignoring that for the rest of the talk. But the first two principal components describe the vast majority of these seasonal and intervariable variation that exists among these 16 climate variables. And so if we plot those against each other, we basically get a picture of the climate envelope of the redwood domain, of these watersheds that contain redwoods up and down the coast of California. And by plotting sort of principal component 1 on the y-axis and PC2 on the x-axis, we can get these variables to line up in a way that maps, or that matches the geographic orientation, north, south, east, west, of these climate variables. So interestingly, first principal component, the north-south axis here, contains one moisture variable and one temperature variable, principally. And then the east-west axis, the coastal axis, also contains one temperature and one moisture variable, primarily. These little vectors on here are the principal component biplot showing the loadings of the 16 input variables into the principal component analysis. I won't go over that in detail. But we can see here in this chart that actually maps climate space against geographic space using a two-dimensional color ramp, that this representation of climate space really maps pretty well to the variation across geographic space. We also see here these areas in light gray. Those are all of the geographic locations that don't have redwoods in their watershed, and we see that the redwood domain, redwoods have available climates nearby that are colder and wetter, that are hotter and drier, that are warmer and milder, but they don't really have any available climate space they're not occupying that is at that foggy, cool, mild edge along the coastal side. So this sort of really confirms our understanding that redwoods are highly associated with this coastal climate. Our next question was whether we can take this sort of continuous representation of multidimensional climate variability across California and distill it into a more manageable set of discrete climate types. And there's a couple things we'd like to optimize as we're developing a set of classifications for climates across the Redwood Range. We'd like to have those climate classifications be as climatically homogeneous as possible. We'd also like them to be spatially contiguous. We don't really want to have climate zones necessarily that are connecting distant climates, like, for example, the Sonoma and Big Sur areas that are really far away and might actually be very different in terms of their ecology and their genetics. So we use this algorithm called SCATER, Spatial Clustering Analysis by Tree Edge Removal, that allows us to build these spatially contiguous or nearly contiguous climatic zones that also are as compact as possible in climate space. And what we see for this analysis is that we're getting 6 distinct climate zones through coastal California. So we have 2 coastal climate zones and 4 interior climate zones. And it would be interesting to see how these line up with other metrics of sort of classifications of redwood ecosystems in terms of ecology, the genetics of these different forest types. We then also wanted to ask how well preserved the diversity of climates is in California. If climate diversity is kind of a proxy for ecological diversity or genetic diversity in redwood forests, it would be nice to know whether we're doing a good job preserving those diverse ecosystems. So for this, we use data from the California Protected Areas database and the California Conservation Easement database, shown in dark and light green here. And we can see when we plot that data back onto the climate domain, where each point, again, is a 1 kilometer pixel of redwood watershed, that those conserved lands are nicely covering the climate space of redwoods. Now onto this question of how climate change is unfolding across this landscape of climate variability in California. There's been a lot of studies that looked at climate change in redwoods, but most of them have focused on sort of future modeled climate change, trying to understand how anthropogenic climate change might affect redwood climates in the future. And one problem with those future studies, well, first of all, there's a lot of uncertainty. Second of all, the spatial grid size of the global climate models that generate future climate projections is pretty large. And so it's not necessarily going to pick up on the really fine-scale dynamics that exist with the ocean and topography and atmosphere interactions across this really steep climate gradient here in coastal California. So for each pixel, for each variable, we're able to use trend statistics across the domain, across the 65-year time series that we have for each variable. These are non-parametric versions of sort of the more ordinary least squares regression that we're used to looking at. And we get maps coming out that look like this. So this is for minimum temperature for the 4 seasons. And we see grayed out locations had no significant climate change, but there are also widespread areas that have already significant climate trends starting to appear. So we're already seeing major signs of climate change starting to unfold here in coastal California as a result of anthropogenic climate change since 1950. We could look at patterns like that for all 16 of our input variables. There's a lot of variability among variables, locations, and seasons in terms of whether there is significant climate change happening and the direction of that climate change. That sort of information overload. So a simpler way of looking at it is to go back to these principal components, right, which are basically, again, a measure of southiness and of coastalness. Principal component 1 we see is pretty much uniformly increasing across the entire redwood domain. So everywhere is becoming a little more like areas to the south. Principal component 2, on the other hand, is displaying much more complex patterns. We see it increasing in some places, decreasing in other places, and it appears that that increase or decrease might actually be related to how close to the coast a particular location is. So what we can do is we can, for each 1 kilometer pixel, we can plot its starting value on the 1950 to 2014 regression line here on the x-axis against the change from 1950 to 2014 on the y-axis and see if there's any relationship there. Again, for principal component 1, basically everywhere is increasing and there doesn't seem to be a strong relationship between how warm it was when it started and how much it warmed. For PC2, however, we see this interesting positive correlation where places that had more interior type climates actually were declining, so they were becoming more interior-like, whereas places that have more coastal type climates were becoming more coastal-like. So we're seeing an increase in the steepness of the climate gradient across coastal California. And that's kind of an exciting new finding that wouldn't necessarily be picked up again by these core scale future global climate model projections. If we think about how that sort of looks in geographic space, what we have again is the first principal component is the north-south gradient. We have southern climates sort of moving up the coast pretty uniformly. However, the east-west gradient is more complex. We have the coastal areas becoming more coastal-like and the interior margin becoming more interior-like. I'm going to kind of skip over these pieces so that I have time for the last real question, which relates to this, and it's a question of whether there's evidence that the coastal climate system here in California is actually buffering the magnitude of climate change along the coast of California. This is a major open question in the literature, right? There's been a lot of studies going back and forth saying, is fog increasing? Is fog decreasing over the 20th century? Will fog and coastal temperatures intensify or sort of disappear over the next 100 years as a result of continued climate change? And this evidence from our analysis sort of points to the fact that there does seem to be a very real buffering effect where the coast of California, the Redwood domain here in red, is changing a lot less rapidly than the areas just to the inland here. So we're comparing Redwood watersheds with all areas within 150 kilometers of Redwood watersheds. What we see is that for all three of our variables except precipitation, the Redwood area along the coast is changing less quickly than the inland areas. That sort of makes sense from a meteorological perspective, right? We know that every summer when it gets really hot in the interior, that results in coastal advection of cool, moist, foggy air off the ocean. So there seems to be this sort of natural thermostat effect that's happening both every summer as well as here through time as climate warms. In the interior, we are getting this buffering effect. This kind of goes into more detail. I'm going to skip over that and just leave us with this little recap of the answers to those key questions. So we think we were able to develop a good indicator of fog through coastal California. We're able to validate the use of these global climate data sets, of the PRISM climate interpolated data sets here in coastal California. To really uncover these dominant spatial patterns of climate variation across the Redwood Range, classify those into discrete climate zones, and then understand how climate change is affecting these patterns already in observed climate change over recent decades. So that is all. Thank you.